The poor are often seen as truly different, and then they become labeled as the other. The perception is that the poor constitute a separate society, governed by their own code of values and behavior. Due to these observations, during the 1980s, discussions and theories focused on the responsibility for poverty, blaming the poor themselves. Some sociologists and anthropologists developed the idea of the culture of poverty. Not all social theorists bought into the culture of poverty, though. Some responses to these ideas were that the culture of poverty theory was blaming the victim. In response to the culture of poverty theory and the worsening conditions for the inner city urban areas, in response to this, William J. Wilson put forward an evolving theoretical and empirical explanation that combined structural and behavioral factors. Wilson saw poverty in inner cities as driven by several critical elements: declining job opportunities, the changing structure of African American families, and outmigration of middle-income African Americans that had become successful. There does appear to be effects that are tied to family structure and cultural peer group ethics, and these effects tend to be the focus of this section, though the critical role of social and physical isolation should also be noted. It's difficult to know the exact effect that these social structures have on inner-city poverty. We still cannot know for sure whether long-term exposure to such an environment leads to fundamental shifts in the norms and values of its inhabitants. This is a much debated issue. Also up for debate is whether change can be achieved through changes in policies like limiting welfare, improving schools, or providing employment, without changing both the environment and the associated behaviors. This debate still divides liberal and conservative policymakers and reform efforts. The fifth hypothesis suggests that the decentralization of employment and increasing residential segregation work together to limit the accessibility of jobs for the inner-city residents, thereby isolating them and trapping them in poverty. This theory of spatial mismatch argues that while firms offering low-skilled jobs, particularly in manufacturing, have left the inner city for the suburbs, their minority workforces have not followed them, both because discrimination in housing markets precludes their residential mobility and also because the costs of commuting and acquiring job search information inhibit access to job opportunities. Furthermore, as the suburbanization of jobs and the middle class increases segregation, inner-city residents become isolated from the economic and cultural mainstream. So while there are geographical changes in industry locations during the past several decades, as firms move to the suburbs, the minority labor supply is slow to adjust. Inner-city residents then have difficulty following the jobs because of racial barriers to residential location in suburban housing markets as well, and their access to jobs becomes more problematic as the cost of travel for them rises. This in turn lowers the net wages and the earnings that inner-city residents can use for housing and other essential necessities. Research has also begun to focus on transportation information mismatches. Proponents of the automobile mismatch point to the higher commute times of the low-income inner-city residents who are transit captives, suggesting strategies to improve transportation or to relocate inner-city residents to the suburb to alleviate that problem. Information mismatch theorists counter that mobility strategies have little impact because people often find jobs through social networks that are frequently spatially situated. So seeing it from that perspective, space is a factor, not only because of the proximity to employment, but also because the extent of segregation in the residential area affects the social networking that often leads to job opportunities. Spatial mismatch is reinforced through discrimination in the housing market too, which prevents the low-skilled labor force from following jobs to the suburbs and maintains racial segregation in both cities and suburbs. The most prevalent form of housing discrimination was racial steering. African American clients were steered to neighborhoods that were less white, lower income, and had lower property values. Research that used paired testers in mortgage lending studies have found that minorities are steered towards government-insured loans and are more likely to be denied loans even when controlling for factors such as greater indebtedness, lower down payments, and weaker credit histories.